Final chapter time. Sometime later, we finally arrived at Osaka Castle. So long as we were at the castle, we weren't likely to run into enemy patrols, and for that I was grateful. Saito-san, how are you feeling? Well, I realized suddenly that I couldn't talk about the Fury's opening with so many people around. Instead, I simply mumbled, at a loss for words. He must have guessed what I was getting at, and for a second or two before responding. Really? But Heisuke and Sona-san said that it was hard for them to be up during the day. Those words pierced my heart. Well, I mean, I could understand his coldness. But the water of life, the thing that would now change his entire life, was because of my father. I wonder. The atmosphere in the castle was certainly restless, even as I watched wounded soldiers being carried in.
Oi, そこにいるのって、もしかしてサイトか?
That voice!
やっぱりサイトだ! お前、生きてたのかよ!
ま、サイトも新八にだけは言われたくねえだろうな。
Nagakura! Harada! You're both safe!
おうよ! この俺が薩長ごときに殺されるはずねえじゃねえか。サイトはどこも怪我してねえみてえだな。さすが無敵の剣の持ち主。俺の目に間違いはなかったぜ。
Yeah, about that. Saito-san's mouth thinned, but he said nothing. There was no way Nagakura could have known the true reason for Saito-san's apparent good health. For a man like Saito-san, someone with absolute faith in his sword and his skill, to admit weakness and reach for the water of life, I could only imagine how torturous it must have been.
Saito-san, Yukimura-kun, 無事だったんですね。
Oh, it's Shimada!
よかった。
Ah, it's always nice to see Shimada. God damn, I wish he had a root.
城中探しても姿が見当たらなかったので、もしやと思ったんですが。
縁起でもねえこと言うなって。斎藤がついてたんだぜ。死ぬはずねえじゃねえか。
そうですよね。でも、本当によかった。
He quickly scrubbed tears from his eyes with a fist and smiled at us. Oh, what happened to Yamazaki anyway? Were they hurt? Harada spoke up, but his voice was strained.
山崎は銃で撃たれて大怪我してる。今松本先生に見てもらってるが、かなり高い熱出して寝込んでるからな。この先どうなるのか微妙な感じだ。
Oh no. What about Inoue? He's alright, isn't he? I felt my stomach clench with dread. Inoue had to be alright. He had to. They were supposed to laugh it off, to smile and reassure me and say that Inoue was fine. But they didn't. It was Nagakura who finally spoke.
ゲンさんは亡くなった。腹にでっかい重曹ができてたさ。多分即死だったと思う。
My throat tightened, and I could feel tears raising to my eyes.
武士というのは何があっても決して約束を違えたりしないものだよ。あの状況で決死隊に志願した長倉君や島田君、そして斎藤君は今の世には珍しい本物の武士だ。武士というのは、男というのは決して女の子を悲しませたりはしないものだよ。だから大丈夫だ。
In a way, I thought a samurai would never do anything to make a girl sad. So why did you die? I swallowed and my throat stung. It was horrible enough to think of the pain he'd suffered from his bullet wound, but even worse was the desire he must have felt as he realized his life was coming to an end.
とりあえずみんなのところに行こうぜ。生き残ってる人間は集まってるはずだから。
Okay. I wiped my tears away and followed.
斎藤、それに雪村も生きてたのか。
心配をおかけして申し訳ございません、副長。
とりあえず生き残った幹部連中はこれで全員揃ったわけだな。
そうなるな。夢も希望もねえ作戦会議とシャレ込むか。
Hopeless?
いや、覚悟して聞いた方がいいぜ。俺も聞いた瞬間は頭から魂が抜けてどっかに飛んでっちゃいそうだったもん。
シンパシー、口の聞き方に気をつけろ。
Wait, what do you mean?
ま、結論から言うと、今回幕軍はかなりの苦境に立たされてる。
Saito-san had told me that the Shogun forces numbered nearly 15,000 men, and that the Satsho and their allies commanded, at most, 5,000. Even I knew 3 to 1 was good odds, so how had the Shogunate ended up in trouble?
中立だとかわけのわからんことを抜かして援軍の要請を断る藩が多くてな。御三家筆頭の尾張藩までが日和見決め込んで中立派を名乗りやがった。
戦が始まってんのに中立もクソもねえだろ。はっきり薩長側につくって言わねえあたりがなんとも姑息だよな。
The 3 houses of the Tokugawa comprised one of the most prestigious domains in Japan. Many previous shoguns were alumni of this group. To think such domain betrayed the shogunate.
戦況はそんなに悪かったのですか。
薩長のやつらが化け物みてえに遠くまで届く新型の銃を使ってやがってな。こっちの射程の外から撃たれちまうんでどうにも防ぎようがねえ。おまけに連発式だから懐に飛び込む隙もねえときた。もう刀じゃ戦はできねえってことだな。
Saito-san looked down and said nothing. He'd built his life around the sword, and now, just like that, it meant nothing.
しかも敵方は銀の銃弾を使っていました。
Silver bullets? But why?
羅刹隊対策に決まってるだろ。向こうにも俺たちのことをよく知ってるやつがいるんだよ。
羅刹は並々ならぬ回復力を有していますが、銀の銃弾でつけられた傷だけは癒すことができません。 我々の武器は人並み外れた体力と機敏さ、そして回復力です。それを封じられてしまえばただの人間と変わりがない。
今回の戦で残ってた羅刹隊のやつらもほとんど殺されちまってさ、俺たちも途方に暮れてるとこなんだ。
That was when Saito-san finally spoke.
副長、ご報告したいことがあります。
なんだ、サイト。
Saito-san looked straight into the commander's eyes and spoke in a calm, level voice.
俺はお預かりしていた落ち水を飲み、羅刹となりました。
なんだって。
Every face in the room turned to Saito-san, shocked.
お前、どうしてそんな真似したんだよ。
そうしなければならぬ状況だった。後悔はしていない。
Hijikata-san was silent for several moments.
そうか。お前もなっちまったか。
That was all he said.
あなたは素晴らしい決断をしましたよ、斉藤君。ようこそこちら側へ。
よし、とりあえず現状報告も終わったところで荷物をまとめてくれ。明日には船で江戸に向かうらしい。
江戸に向かうというのは何故？ここで慶喜公と共に籠城するのではないのですか？
Their faces fell when I spoke.
俺たちの総大将様は一生懸命戦ってた幕軍を置き去りにしてとっくに江戸に戻っちまってるんだとよ。
Did that say I? That should have been Saito, right? The fuck?
聞いた時はさすがに呆れだね。こんな戦前代未聞だぜ。多分これから先もねえんじゃねえの。今後の展開がどうなっちまうのか楽しみすぎてしょうがねえや。
Oh no. Inoue had died and Yamazaki had been wounded. Though they were the only ones I knew, I had little doubt that many other men had fought for the shogun and been wounded or killed. And instead of staying to support his army, he'd abandoned them to their fate and been the first to run to safety in Edo? It was awful.
慶喜公が俺たちを捨てて逃げた。
ま、上には上の事情があるってことだろう。俺たちは俺たちで後の世に恥じねえ戦をすりゃいいだけのことだ。
そうですね。
He nodded, his face as placid as ever, but in his eyes I could see defeat and despair. We need to begin preparing for our return to Edo, but all of the warriors seemed dejected, slumped by the heaviness of our defeat. Saito-san, of course, wasn't safe from this dejection. Saito-san. I stopped myself for a second, but decided to approach him. However, he kept his eyes fixed on his tatami mat, not even acknowledging me. Saito-san. I called out to him once more, and all of a sudden, he snapped out of his concentration, and he shot a glance towards me.
すまない。考え事をしていた。先ほど副長が言っていた通り、上には上の事情が、自分たちには自分たちのすべきことがある。まず負傷者の状況を確認しよう。救護の手が足りていないはずだ。
Saito-san didn't seem to believe his own words, and his tone lacked any luster or emotion. I couldn't really blame him, though. He and the other Shinsengumi captains had risked their lives to uphold the shogunate flag in battle, and then Lord Yoshinobu just gave up. To think our Supreme Commander could even think to abandon his men and his army.
何をしている？ここには怪我人が大勢運び込まれている。医学の心得のあるあんたが行けば助けになるはずだ。見に行ってくれ。
Saito-san seemed eager for me to leave, but I just stood there, looking back at him, and instead of leaving, I asked him a question. Saito-san, what's going to happen to the Shinsengumi?
どうなるとは。
Saito-san was clearly annoyed, throwing another question at me. Seeing the coldness of his response made me flinch a little. But I thought it was an important question to ask, so I did what I thought was necessary to help my anxieties. Lord Yoshinobu has abandoned us, right? So if we follow him back to Edo, what will happen then? Does his retreat mean that the shogunate has no further plans to fight against the Sacho troops?
まだそうなると決まったわけではなかろう。もしかすると江戸で力を蓄え再選の機会を伺うつもりなのかもしれん。俺たちが気をもんでも仕方あるまい。
But
先ほども言ったが、ここには怪我人が数多く運び込まれている。差し当たって必要なのは怪我人の船への護送、そして江戸への帰還の準備だ。助けを必要としている者がいて、俺たちには彼らを助ける力がある。余計なことに気を取られている場合ではない。
his words came at me quickly and aggressively, and it made me think something was off. Even when he seemed agitated or things were hectic, Saito-san always found time to speak with me or answer my questions. But today he was completely flippant, looking as though he were trying to avoid talking to me altogether. How should I answer? I understand. I understand. I will help Saito-san. There was so much to worry about, but now wasn't the time to stress about it. Our tasks were beginning to pile up and many people were depending on us. Then, I shouldn't be overly concerned about what could be and just focus on the present.
その意気だ。では行くぞ。
His tone seemed to perk up even just a tad, and he bowed his head. When I looked at Saito-san's back, his posture seemed so broken. I stopped and called out for him. Ever since I lost contact with my father, I felt so lonely and full of worry. But I thought that my worry would do me no good, so I made the decision to come to Kyoto myself to search for him. So I may not know exactly what you're feeling, or how you're dealing with those feelings, but in the end, I think what's important is to trust those feelings and act on them. Saito-san stopped in his tracks, and he seemed to twitch a bit. Soon he turned around to face me. Just a second ago, his eyes seemed dead, but it appears they have been reignited with purpose. He looked at me sternly.
行くぞ。
His words were curt, but it felt like a sense of determination had returned to Saito-san. As the two of us were leaving the castle, he turned around once more, sadness resting in his face. Are you all right? I asked him softly, but he gave me no answer. After a pause, he wiped the cold sweat from his brow, and he looked into my eyes.
問題ない。行くぞ。
His voice was resolute. Being out in the sun as a fury, from what I'd heard, was quite painful. If you start feeling sick, then maybe you should rest until evening? I made a timid suggestion, but Saito-san quietly looked back at me and muttered,
先ほどのあんたの言葉で目が覚めた。
Hmm? The suddenness of his statement caught me off guard, and I stared confused at him. He turned to face his feet, and his tone seemed almost self-deprecating.
たとえ慶喜公がどのような行動を取ろうと、我々が主君を見捨てていいということにはならない。俺は一体何を迷っていたのか。
Saito-san looked at me sheepishly, as if he were embarrassed by his own doubts earlier. Seeing his reaction made me realize something. All this time, Saito-san worked hard to let his doubts and worries never get the best of him. But I wasn't the only one who felt those doubts. Saito-san, this whole time, was also anxious. I mean, he never showed any signs of worry when he was ordered to spy on the guard or when he drank the water of life. In my heart, somehow, I had just assumed that he was impervious to worry and that he always got the better of his emotions. Then he looked longingly into my eyes.
幕府が今後どうなるのか、そして我々新選組が何を信じるのかはまだ分かっていない。だがそれも全て江戸に戻ってからのこと。我々の行く末はこれからだ。だからあんたの不安はわかるが、今は考える必要はない。今は自分たちのすべきことをなし、そして江戸を目指す。いいな。
Saito-san turned back around to make his way to the dock, but his aura had completely changed. If I had done anything to improve Saito-san's mood, then nothing could make me happier. I was thrilled that even just once that I was able to give back to Saito-san. I know that Saito-san and the Shinsengumi will be able to find their purpose as we return to Edo. But when we return to Edo, what awaits me? The whole reason I left Edo was for the purpose of finding my father. Later that night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Tomorrow, the men of the Shinsengumi would be on their way aboard a ship to Edo. But what was to become of me? There were rumors floating around that my father was siding with the Sacho troops, and now to top it off, he was with Kazuma. I'm sure this was what Saito-san had reported to Hijikata-san when they spoke together. So technically, the Shinsengumi no longer had any obligation to look after me. I was running through all those thoughts when I heard footsteps from outside my room. I wonder who it could be at this hour. Softly, I slid my door open to take a quick peek and see whom it was.
雪村、まだ起きていたのか。
Saito-san!
寝不足での船旅は過酷だ。少しでも体を休めておくに越したことはない。
I know that, but when we return to Edo, all of you will be on standby for the next battle, right?
そうだ。
I felt nervous speaking, especially with what I'd wanted to say next, but... So, am I not allowed to come along with you guys?
なんだと。
I know I'm not really of much use on the battlefield, and I can barely protect myself. Well, especially if we're up against Kazuma, then I stand no chance of protecting myself. And I know that the reason you let me stay with you all was because I was just looking for my father. So, yeah. There's nothing really keeping you guys responsible for me anymore. Does that make me a burden?
戦いに関してはその通りだろうな。あんた自身が一番よくわかっているだろう。
His words were a lot harsher than I anticipated, and I could only hang my head. He was right. All I'd ever be was a burden if I couldn't fight, but still insisted to be by their side.
鳥羽伏見の戦であんたも実感したはずだ。これからの戦は今までのものとは違う。今日隣にいた者が明日にはムクロへと変わる。そんな日が続くに違いない。それでも我々は武士として命果てるまで戦い抜く覚悟があるが、あんたは元来こちら側の人間ではない。戦いの中に身を置く理由などないはずだ。
Hearing Saito-san's words made me realize that, even if it hurts to say it, he puts my safety above almost anything. Saito-san wasn't necessarily the best person with words, but it still made my heart warm to hear it. I do have a reason, though. You saved my life, Saito-san, so I want to pay you back.
我々の都合でしたことだ。恩義に感じる必要はどこにもない。
That's not a good enough excuse. Would you be satisfied hearing it from my side if I had told you the same thing? Saito-san turned away, refusing to look at me as if he were dealing with a petulant child from which he could not wait to leave. Eventually.
失礼。
Saito-san reached for the kodachi on my hips. No, it's just hip. And without a word, took it into his hands, sheathed. He gripped my kodachi tightly.
先ほども言ったが、我々と共に戦いの中に身を置くことになれば、いつ命を落とすかわからん。それでも我々についてくると、そういうのだな。
Saito-san looked into my eyes intently, gazing towards me with a quiet seriousness, and I gave a huge nod.
ならばこの木立を取れ。あんたにその覚悟があるのなら、命を落とすだけの理由があるというのならばな。
Saito suddenly handed me back the kodachi, watching my movements as if he was still testing me. His eyes glimmered against the light, and he stared back at me while I gulped nervously.
だが忘れるな。この木立を取った瞬間から、お前をもう客人としては扱わぬ。二度と引き返せぬ道に足を踏み入れることになるのだぞ。
His eyes were stern, and they were staring at me with such intensity that I couldn't breathe. But I asked to stay, keeping all of this in mind. With this newfound resolve, I reached for my kodachi, and Saito-san smiled faintly.
お前の覚悟、しかと見定めた。もう江戸へ帰れなどとは言わん。どこまででもついてこい。
はい。Although his expectations for me were huge, I felt warm from his words and I loosened up. During the 4 years in which Shinsengumi had looked after me, I couldn't ever shake the thought of feeling like an outsider. But now, for the first time, I finally felt like I've been accepted as one of them. I will follow the Shinsengumi wherever you guys go, and I'll be by your side the whole time, Saito-san. No matter what happens in the future, I have faith in everyone, including you, Saito-san.
そうか。
He kept his response brief. But I could see the smile forming on Saito-san's lips. I wondered if he was even a little happy to hear that I was going to join him. I'm sure we will be facing the Satsucho and Kazuma when we return to... we return to Edo. God damn it. Why are there so many mistakes in this route? What? It's like specific mistakes of repeating words. What? I'm sure we'll be facing the Satsucho and even Kazuma when we return to Edo, but I felt like as long as I'm with Saito, I'll be alright. I had a mysterious confidence well up in my heart, and I smiled back.